A couple of local cops thought they'd give me a warm welcome to their little town. So they tied me to a lamppost in the middle of the street and turned it into a show, like I was just another nobody passing through. Little did they know, they had no idea who they were dealing with and how badly this would backfire on them. But let's rewind and start at the beginning. The name's George. I'm 54, been around the block a few times, and I just landed in this sleepy little town in South Carolina to take on the role of chief of police. Not my first rodeo. I've seen my share of trouble, but this place? It had a vibe like no other. A tight-knit community, everyone knew everyone, and fresh faces weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. It didn't take long to realize that the local cops here liked to play by their own rules. You could almost smell it in the air. The sense that they ran the show, and if you weren't careful, you'd be just another casualty of their little kingdom. On my first day, before even reporting for duty, I figured I'd get a feel for the town. So, I threw on an old cap and a weathered jacket, trying to blend in as just another guy on the street. Took a walk to the local cafe, the kind that looked like it had been standing since the dinosaurs roamed. The moment I walked in, I felt it, eyes on me from every corner. The kind of stares that make you feel like you're already guilty of something. In the back, two cops were laughing like they had a joke I wasn't in on, but it was clear who they were laughing at. Me. They kept sneaking glances, sizing me up, already decided I was just some newbie to mess with or, at best, ignore. Their badges gleamed in the dim light, but their attitude? Not so shiny. I ordered a coffee, played it cool, just to see how they'd react. I didn't plan on revealing who I was just yet. No, this was a recon mission. But then, just as I took my coffee to go, one of them barked at me from across the room. "Hey old man, you lost or something? 'Cause you sure don't look local." I half turned, kept my expression blank. "Just passing through," I replied, though clearly they weren't buying it. One of them, tall guy with a smug grin, shot back, "Well, maybe keep passing. Strangers don't last long around here if you get my drift." I just shrugged and walked out, but believe me, I could feel them watching every step I took down that street. Something told me my new job was about to be way more than just paperwork and meetings. Next morning, I decided to go for a run, just outside of town, clear my head and get a feel for the place. Fresh air, a little peace, nothing out of the ordinary. About halfway through, though, I heard the sound of a patrol car pulling up alongside me. Yep, it was those same two from the cafe, Daniel and Henry, the dynamic duo. Daniel, the tall, wiry blonde with that smirk of his, leaned out the window and shouted, "Hey runner, you lost?" The way he said it, you'd think I'd just run onto some private property with a no trespassing sign slapped across my forehead. His partner, Henry, a bulky guy who looked like he could bench press half a car, chimed in, "Yeah, are you sure you're welcome around here?" I kept my cool, slowed down a bit and replied, "Just going for a run. Pretty sure that's still allowed around here, right?" Henry shot me a grin, one of those smug, "I know something you don't" kinds of looks. Allowed, maybe, but strangers don't exactly get the warmest welcome here, especially those who don't know our rules. Before I could even open my mouth to ask what on earth that was supposed to mean, they hopped out of the car. Daniel stepped up close, way too close, and started patting down my pockets without so much as a "may I." I took a breath, keeping myself calm. They started rummaging around, throwing smug glances back at each other like this was some kind of game. Daniel finally pulled out some random scrap of plastic from my pocket, his face lighting up with some twisted excitement. Well, look what we have here," he sneered, holding it up like it was some kind of trophy. "This yours?" I just stared at him, not taking the bait. It was pretty obvious they'd had this little setup planned. Alright, so by this point, I'd had just about enough of their friendly welcome, but I knew I had to keep my cool. They had no idea who I was, and this definitely wasn't the moment for a big reveal. I played it calm, even as they each grabbed one of my arms and yanked me toward the center of town. No explanations, no questions, just dragging me along like I was some lost pet they'd found roaming the streets. They hauled me right over to this big lamppost in the middle of town square, where folks were milling around, doing their usual morning routines. A few people stopped curious. Others didn't seem surprised at all, like they'd seen this kind of scene before. Daniel and Henry looked like they were putting on some sort of twisted show, cracking jokes like they were at a comedy club. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel announced, with a mocking bow, "we got ourselves a real big city troublemaker here." Henry, playing along, added, "Yup, think he's got a few tricks up his sleeve, or maybe in his pockets." They tied my hands around that lamppost, real dramatic, making sure everyone could see. Some folks started pulling out their phones. Recording like this was the highlight of their day. Others just chuckled, shaking their heads. I could see Daniel soaking it all in, looking around at his audience, with the smirk that made my stomach turn. He leaned in close, loud enough for everyone to hear, and sneered, "Looks like we got ourselves a troublemaker. Huh? Can't have people like you just waltzing into our town." The whole thing was beyond ridiculous, but it wasn't funny. It was disturbing. These guys were so into their act, they didn't even care how obvious their setup looked. I'd seen some low moves in my day, but this was something else. I had to remind myself to stay calm, just let them dig their own hole. So there I was, tied to that lamppost, like I was some kind of public attraction, while Daniel and Henry strutted around like they just bagged the year's biggest catch. They didn't even try to keep it low-key. These guys were basking in the attention. People had their phones out, filming from every angle, chuckling, shaking their heads. Some folks even looked genuinely curious, probably wondering what the deal was with this outsider in their town. Turns out, that little scene didn't stay a local secret for long. By the next morning, clips of the mysterious stranger tied to the pole were blowing up online. Comments were flooding in, and boy, did the theory start rolling. Some people thought I was a drifter who'd crossed the wrong lines. Others were straight up calling out the cops, asking, "Who's this guy, and why does he look like he's stuck in some old Wild West showdown?" People wanted answers, and fast. Pretty soon, local news caught wind of it. A few journalists showed up, looking for their next big scoop, and they were relentless. You could see them pushing through the crowd. Henry's out, looking to catch a quote or two. One of them even cornered a bystander, asking, "What did this man do? Did anyone see him commit a crime?" The response was a shrug and a muttered, "Beats me. Looks like the cops are just having some fun." Meanwhile, Daniel and Henry were still riding their high, pacing around like they owned the square. They'd pose, crack jokes, make a real scene of it, like they were local celebrities. If only they knew how fast this story was spiraling out of their control. Watching it all unfold, I couldn't help but feel a spark of anticipation. They were giving me exactly what I needed, setting the stage perfectly without even realizing it. The spotlight was on, and soon enough, the real show was about to start. After a long night, and trust me, it felt like the longest night ever. My phone rang early in the morning. Caller ID showed it was the main office, and I knew exactly why they were calling. Word had reached up the chain, and they weren't happy. This little town's idea of fun was now a full-blown scandal, and Daniel and Henry were about to get one rude awakening. I walked into the station, calm and collected, feeling the weight of my uniform as I put it on. This wasn't just another day at the office. This was my moment to set things straight. With my badge gleaming and my uniform crisp, I made my way to the main hall. You could almost hear the tension building up in the air, like the calm before a storm. And just as expected, in walked Daniel and Henry, laughing about some inside joke, not a care in the world. They hadn't even bothered to check who I really was. They just assumed I was some nobody they could mess with. But the second they spotted me, standing there in full uniform, they froze. I could see the shock spreading across their faces, slowly transforming into something that looked a lot like panic. I let the silence stretch, watched them squirm, their eyes darting around like they were searching for an escape. Finally, I broke the silence, keeping my voice calm but firm. "We've got ourselves a situation, gentlemen," I started, looking them dead in the eyes. "And you're both right in the middle of it." The color drained from their faces as they processed what was happening. This was a scene they hadn't scripted, a game where they had no control. Daniel stammered something, trying to come up with an excuse, but I raised a hand to stop him. "Save it, Daniel," I said, my tone cold. "I've seen enough to know exactly what's been going on here." I took a step closer, looked Daniel and Henry square in the eyes, and asked, "So what? Neither of you recognized your new chief?" The room went dead silent. You could practically feel everyone holding their breath, like they were watching a slow-motion train wreck they couldn't look away from. A few of the other officers started glancing at each other wide-eyed, finally putting two and two together. Daniel and Henry, though, they stood there frozen, trying way too hard to look confident, but their expressions were giving it all away. They were cornered, and they knew it. I pulled out my phone and hit play on the video, their little performance from yesterday, complete with all their smirks and mocking comments. I held it up for the whole room to see. In case anyone here is confused, this is what went down. These two thought they'd have a little fun at the expense of some stranger without even bothering to check who I was. The rest of the team watched in stunned silence. You could see the shock turn into something closer to disgust as they realized how far these guys had taken things. Daniel looked like he was about to say something, maybe try to explain himself, but then he did something I didn't see coming. Instead of apologizing, Daniel squared his shoulders, lifted his chin, and said, "Look, this is just how things work here. Tradition, we have a little fun with the outsiders, keeps people in line." His voice had this defiant edge, like he still thought he had the upper hand. I raised an eyebrow. Tradition? So you've got a tradition of publicly humiliating people just because they're new in town? Daniel smirked, looking around the room for support. It's not hurting anyone, just a bit of harmless fun. I glanced around, saw the rest of the team watching this unfold. Their expressions, a mix of disbelief and discomfort. They were starting to realize just how deep this went. And for Daniel and Henry, the reality of the situation was finally sinking in. Their little tradition had just met its end right there in that room. Within days, Daniel and Henry's little act had blown up like a summer wildfire. This wasn't just local gossip anymore. The story was everywhere, from city talk shows to state news channels. Reporters were camping outside the station and cameras seemed to be everywhere, flashing and rolling, ready to capture every last detail. The town had never seen anything like it, and honestly, neither had I. The community was livid. Folks who used to turn a blind eye or chuckle at Daniel and Henry's antics were now demanding accountability. People were marching outside the station, carrying signs, calling for justice. It was like a storm brewing that no one had seen coming, and it wasn't about to let up until those two faced the music. I called a meeting and gathered the whole team in the main hall. This wasn't going to be a quiet warning or a polite reminder. This was me drawing a line. I looked around the room, my gaze landing on each officer, making it clear this wasn't just about Daniel and Henry anymore. From this point on, I said, voice steady but firm, any behavior that disrespects the people in this community will be met with immediate termination. No warnings, no second chances. There was a silence as everyone took it in, realizing that things were about to change in a big way. Daniel and Henry stood off to the side, their faces pale as it dawned on them that their little game was over. They weren't untouchable anymore, and everyone knew it. Without another word, I reached into my pocket, pulled out 2 termination forms, and signed them right there for everyone to see. Daniel, Henry, hand over your badges. Your time here is done. The entire room watched as I handed the papers to them. There were no cheers, no applause, just a heavy silence as they took off their badges, their faces showing that they finally understood the gravity of what they'd done. The message was clear. From now on, the town's officers were there to serve and respect every single resident, not to treat them as a sideshow. After Daniel and Henry's hasty exit from the force, the real fallout began. The prosecutor's office jumped in, determined to get to the bottom of whatever traditions these two had been running. They started digging into every arrest, every questionable call Daniel and Henry had made, and believe me, it didn't take long before they had a mountain of complaints and accusations piling up. People who'd stayed silent for years were finally stepping forward, sharing stories about how they'd been humiliated, bullied, and worse, all for Daniel and Henry's twisted version of fun. It was like a floodgate had opened, and suddenly the whole town was talking. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about setting things right for everyone they'd wronged. Pretty soon, the courtroom became the center stage, with people demanding justice, compensation, you name it. Daniel and Henry were facing more than just a pink slip. They were facing dire repercussions. The town was now seeing what true accountability looked like, and it was obvious that they had no intention of letting these two get away with it. As I stood outside the station and observed the community coming together, I realized that this was the precise reason I had accepted the position. Even if it took some shaking to get there, this town was prepared for change. It was a clear and loud statement. The time for ignoring it was over. Knowing we had turned a corner, I inhaled deeply and felt at ease. Daniel and Henry were not the last to strive for justice and respect. This was only the start. Now the community realized that things had changed, and I was here to see that they remained so. If you were Daniel or Henry, how would you have handled meeting a stranger who turned out to be your new boss?